the long-term economic impact on the UK, Scotland, and the EU of Brexit. You saw that there were a large number of studies, and I'll show you a slide with some of them in a moment, which highlighted that Brexit could be quite costly, both to the UK and Scotland and other constituent parts of the UK. There are a number of channels where these costs arise, and also potential gains that those who favoured Brexit also pointed out. Let me just highlight some of them. Reducing trade reduces economic efficiency. That's one of the biggest costs. Some of that would come not through tariff barriers, but through so-called non-tariff barriers, which are about impediments to trade, which are nothing to do with tariffs, but might be to do with other ways in which trade is blocked by, for instance, regulation. And the basic reasons why barriers to trade, any type of barrier to trade, is bad for our economy is because if you export less, it impacts on your economic output. But barriers to imports are also potentially bad because you're pushing up prices for consumers. You're having to produce those goods perhaps yourself at a higher cost. The second reason why less trade is bad is that if your economy shrinks, it also has budgetary effects. You have less of a tax base if your economy shrinks, and you can spend less on public services. And I'll say a bit more of that in a moment. Third, and I'm going to stress this tonight because it's really important for Scotland particularly, if you have less inward migration to the UK, that reduces labour supply. And as we shall see, this is a particular issue for Scotland as well as other parts of the UK. A fourth channel through which we have an economic cost from Brexit is through less foreign direct investment. This is hugely important for the UK. There's about £1 trillion stock of foreign direct investment currently in the UK, which has come from other countries which use the UK as a base to export into the European Union. Half of that investment in the UK, half of that 1 trillion stock comes from other EU member states. There's also a dynamic effect, lower productivity growth, because if you have lower trade, it is generally assumed that this will have cause your productivity to grow slower because those sectors that are exposed to trade tend to have more rapid productivity growth. Those that argue that Brexit could have positive effects generally stress 2 points, and these are the last 2 bullet points here. One, less regulation. If you're not in the European Union, you don't have to adhere to European regulations, so you could have a more dynamic economy. As I'll explain later, the problems with this line of argument is that if you want to maintain a trade relationship with Europe, you have to minimize frictions, and that causes a conflict with this. And then there's a minority alternative view, and this was seen by a handful of economists during the Brexit debate, that actually Brexit could have a positive impact on our trade because it could allow us to costlessly reallocate our trade away from slow-growing European countries towards more dynamic, faster-growing non-European countries like Asia. Now, that, the argument goes, will increase the efficiency of the UK economy. Now, as I said, that's a minority view, and I'll explain why it's a minority view. This is a busy slide. I'm not going to go through the detail. A lot of studies were carried out before the referendum. Many of these you'll have seen in the press by a number of agencies going up to down. The OECD, the CBI, in collaboration with PricewaterhouseCoopers, the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, the Centre for Economic Performance at the London School of Economics, Oxford Economics, the famous Treasury studies, and then a couple of other, one more favourable to Brexit called Economies for Brexit, who produced the results showing that Brexit could be positive, and Open Europe, a group that was looking at one particular scenario. The 3 scenarios that most of them looked at, and not all of them looked at all 3 scenarios, hence some NAs in there. One is for a soft Brexit. This is where the UK would leave the EU, but would stay within the European single market, part of the European Economic Association, European Economic Area, and essentially through that would trade as freely as possible within the European single market. Now, the thing about that is that you would be inside the single market, like Norway, Liechtenstein, and Iceland, but you would be outside the customs union. So you would still have some impediments to trade because there would still be some need to check goods as they pass across borders, rules of origins in the EU, and all that. The middle scenario is which is really one where, as you see, the UK government, as you'll see later, the UK government has fixed its objectives on, is this notion that you could have a standalone free trade agreement with the EU. And this is the model, if you like, that Canada has currently in terms of its new trade deal with the EU. It's also similar to the sort of model that Switzerland has, although it's a bit more complex in Switzerland's case. The third scenario is one where the UK fails to reach an agreement, and this is known colloquially as a hard Brexit. And then you have another scenario called the WTO, or cliff edge scenario, which has been in the press quite a lot in recent weeks, which is around the possibility that you cannot reach a free trade agreement as you're leaving the EU, and therefore the UK would stand alone on its own 2 feet in the world, trading under World Trade Organization or WTO rules, and essentially would have to adhere to these rules, which, as I will see later, are actually a bit constraining in many respects. So each of these studies looked at potential losses. Some of them looked at some of the channels I mentioned. Some of them only looked at trade. Others looked at budget and trade. Others looking at productivity effects. And that's why you get different numbers. So occasionally when people say economists don't know what they're doing because they have lots of different numbers, well, it depends on what assumptions you make. All these studies tend to define generally that you would incur losses to GDP of roughly between 2 and 9.5% by 2030, except for the last 2 studies. This, and I'll mention this in a moment. To be clear, these are not economic forecasts, and this is really important. They're not saying that UK GDP is going to be lower in 2030 than it is now. They are evaluations of where UK GDP might be relative to where it would have been if Brexit hadn't happened. That's the counterfactual. And that is what these studies show. And generally they find that between 2% loss and as close to a 10% loss in most of the studies, with a couple of exceptions. The exception is Economies for BrExit, and the reason why they have such a positive result is that they make an assumption in their model which no other models assumes. They basically don't believe a key tenet of economic evidence in the area of trade, i.e. that you tend to trade more with the countries that are closest to you geographically. So if you look at the evidence on trade flows, economic and econometric evidence on trade flows, you'll find that most countries tend to trade more, all other things being equal, i.e. relative incomes, relative prices, trade barriers, with the countries closest to them relative to countries far away. So for instance, the US will trade more with Canada than with Asia. We will trade more with Europe than we will trade with Asia or North America. And these effects are so-called gravity effects. And most economists believe these gravity effects are important because they're there in the data. They tell us that these patterns of trade persist. Now, what economists for BrExit find is that if we can costlessly reallocate and attach ourselves to these fast-growing Asian markets, then, of course, there isn't a problem. Your GDP will be higher. But the reason why it's not easy to do that is because of gravity effects. So unless you believe you can defy gravity, this result is likely to be a bit of an outlier. And I personally, again, believe that what the economic data has told us for the last decades is true, and that these studies are much more likely to tell us what the real effect of Brexit is. The other study which I should mention, the Open Europe one, put a lot of emphasis on deregulation, which is another reason why they get a range which is slightly positive. So you may choose to believe the alternative picture of the world given to you by the handful of economists who, I think there was about 6 or 7 who believe in this positive result, but I personally think that the impact from immigration, less immigration, productivity, less trade, budget effects are actually likely to be quite negative. Let's drill into a couple of the assumptions and points made into the analysis. First, the importance of immigration for the UK economy. Employment has risen quite dramatically in the UK since the economic crisis in 2007-8, and domestic employment has risen quite a lot. And indeed, the UK has absorbed additional immigration. Unfortunately, during debate on Brexit, the argument was that this immigration had depressed average incomes in the UK. Now, there's many studies on this which actually completely deny this evidence. The rise in EU immigration has been a very important source of labour supply. It has actually added to the skills in the UK across the skills spectrum. The concern during the campaign was that this EU immigration had lowered real wages. There's absolutely no evidence for that whatsoever. There's many studies, but this shows you a graph from one of such study by Jonathan Wadsworth and co-authors at the LSE. And this plots various local areas, tries to look at what has happened to the percentage change to UK-born wages. So it's looking at whether immigrants have had a negative impact on the wages of locals, and looking at the rate of immigration in each of these local areas. And there's absolutely no correlation between the two. There's no impact of immigration on local wages, or on wages on local wages for local-born employees. There is a negative. Interesting, you'll see that actually there has been a fall in the wage of UK locals in these local areas, and that is the key, actually, of what Brexit was about. In many respects, since 2007-8, real wages have been depressed in the UK. It's got nothing to do with immigration. They've just been depressed because of the way in which national income has been shared between employment and profits. However, it's easy to blame immigrants in that sort of situation. But it's not. Immigration actually has allowed GDP to be higher than it would otherwise have been. There's just one study that finds some small wage losses for low-skilled employees, study by Nicol and Salahin a couple of years ago. However, that did not divide up the population between EU migrants and UK locals. So it's not, this study is more accurate. The other channel I wanted to emphasize is the budgetary impact of Brexit, because again, I think this will be really important in years to come if we end up with a hard Brexit. These figures come from the Office for Budgetary Responsibility. It comes from the autumn statement. It was published around November last year. The results have not changed drastically in the March budget. If anything, those figures have changed slightly for 16-17, 17-18, but for the outer years, they stay very much as they are. And this is an attempt by the OBR to look at the fiscal effects of Brexit because of less immigration, because of less productivity growth. And you'll see, there's also some positive effects, by the way, just to be fair, because of lower interest rates, because if the economy is depressed, the Bank of England is going to have to keep lower interest rates, and other factors also playing, presumably mostly to do with welfare payments, also some positive effects. But in total, the impact is actually to increase borrowing as a result of Brexit. And the assumptions the OBR made is that the UK leaves the EU in April 2019, that as a result, export-imports trade will fall, that immigration will be tighter, and they're assuming that all the money that is saved from the EU budget gets reinvested, by the way. So remember that figure on the bus, on the red bus? That figure on the red bus is actually allowed for in these figures. It's not as much as on the figure on the red bus. That was a bit of an exaggeration. But about 13 billion a year net gets reinvested back in the UK economy. But despite all of that, there's still an increase in borrowing, i.e. there's a shortfall in taxation relative to spending. Having looked at the UK, let me look at Scotland, because I think Scotland is really important. It has a slightly different pattern in terms of its economic structure and population structure. As many of you are aware, for many years Scotland was worried about its population trends. Its population has now stabilized, it's growing again. A declining population obviously matters because the decline impacts on our ability here in Scotland to grow the economy. It's actually become much more important now, because as some of you know, in the Scotland Act 2016, the way in which the Barnett formula, the block grant adjustment works, is partly dependent on growing our tax base relative to the rest of the UK. In fact, The UK government were arguing during those negotiations around the fiscal framework that actually we should be exposed to some demographic risks as well. And that question is still open and may be revisited after 2021. If you're going to be subject to those risks to your tax base and to your demography, then it's really, really important that you're able to grow your demography. Otherwise, you're going to end up with severe costs. And as we can see, immigration from the EU, these are the figures, the raw figures. Many of them have come from the EU 8, so sort of 8 accession countries, although quite a healthy number also coming from the original 14 before the accession countries. Smaller number from the EU 2, that's Romania and Bulgaria, and indeed the Baltic states. I think a really interesting figure is what is happening to young people, because we worry about an aging society. What's significant here is the 115,000 non-UK EU nationals aged 16 and over, between the ages of 16 and 34, who've come to Scotland. They constitute now 4.5% of employment in Scotland. And a further 7,000 were unemployed, not a large number, searching work, and 29,000 inactive, many of them family members of course, 115,000 who are here working. And that's, I think, a very significant number. From wearing my university hat, I know that many of these people come here as students and then stay and settle and actually make a significant impact. What is really interesting is that their employment rate is higher than that for UK nationals. So many of them, more of them, are in employment. And you remember again some of the debates during the referendum, people are coming here, not working, claiming welfare. The statistics actually belie that. And it's even for this case where age 35, 49, statistics are slightly smaller, but the employment rates for EU nationals tend to be much, much higher. So now let me tell you a bit about the potential impact. You've seen some of those results in the big spreadsheet there for the UK as a whole. And you can actually do some of this work for Scotland as well. This is work that's been done by the Scottish Government, and Gary Gillespie from the Scottish Government is here. Some of this work has been done to inform the work of the Standing Council. What this work does is, and this particular slide does, is to show using a model which has been developed by the Scottish Government in connection with the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, what the potential impact is of a cliff-edge Brexit. And I'm going to focus a bit on cliff-edge Brexit because, as I'll say later, I think it's a real possibility. It's based on the National Institute model, and you saw some of the results of the National Institute model a moment ago. And you'll see what this model predicts, this Scottish Government version of the National Institute Global Econometric Model, in terms of the impact on GDP, consumption, household investment, business investment, and net trade. And as you can see, the numbers are pretty drastic. It's 9.4% reduction in UK GDP. The effects for Scotland are slightly smaller. That's partly because for Scotland, we're slightly less exposed to EU trade than the rest of the UK. That's why that 8.5 is smaller, the minus 8.5 is smaller than the minus 9.4. If you compare this to some other studies which have been done for the UK, you see that this, again, is a higher number, similar to the Treasury number, but this includes all the various effects that we were discussing earlier to do with reduced trade, productivity losses from reduction in trade, reduction in foreign direct investment, and so on. Some of you may have seen this study here, which is that wasn't on the sheet before. It's the Fraser-Valander Institute at the University of Strathclyde. Some of you will know from reading the press that they did a study for the European External Relations Committee of Holyrood. Their results are using a slightly different model called a CGE model, so-called computable general equilibrium model. I won't go into the details, but essentially it's a very different kind of model than the other ones using NIGEM. One of the things that I think the Fraser-Valander model tends to ignore, apart from having these two gaps here, obviously, one of the other things which it doesn't do, because of the nature of the model, and not a fault of the analysis, it's the nature of the model. It actually assumes that there is possibly some feedback benefit for Scotland in terms of employment as a result of the UK faring worse out of Brexit than Scotland. I don't actually think that's particularly realistic. I do think that these results are actually much more in line with what one might expect. The other point to make is that migration effects are particularly important, and as are productivity effects. This is a chart which shows you how that minus 8.5 actually sort of winds over the period from the shock to 2030. Now, one point to make is that the model has been run as if the shock happens in 2017. Now, of course, we haven't left the EU yet. If this doesn't actually transpire in 2017, but it starts in 2019, then you can just renumber these all the way up to 2032, and the pattern will be exactly the same. It doesn't actually matter which year you start the shock. The point is that the major effects are not only coming through less trade, the major effects are coming because of the orange bit, which is to do with migration, less migration into Scotland, less growth, and as a result, we lose out economically. And the big turquoise bit, which is loss of productivity. Less trade, less migration, less productivity growth, and so on. That's the sort of dynamic effect. And this model probably doesn't take into account all the barriers to trade. It will, of course, take account to some extent of non-tariff barriers, because that's how it's modeled. It's modeled as a reduction in trade, and some of that will be due to non-tariff barriers, and you've got to estimate how that's done. And Guy and his team will have made assumptions in line with what the literature says about the impact of non-tariff barriers. But it captures most of the other channels that we've highlighted. Now, I hear you say nothing has happened yet, so what are you going on about? The UK economy is still growing. The skies over England are clear. Indeed, economic growth in the UK has remained buoyant since the Brexit referendum. But that's because there are no barriers to trade yet. We haven't left the EU, and we have not left the single market. Where economists, I think, did get it very wrong, and blame economists, is in assuming that the effects of Brexit in 2019, between 2019 and these things will, as the earlier graph shows, will wind gradually up between 2019 for around 20 years or so. Where we got it wrong is in assuming that this would translate into an immediate fall in both consumer and investment spending. And the reason that some economists, including the Bank of England, thought that this might happen is because the thought was, well, if households and businesses know that there's bad times ahead, they'll actually anticipate some of that and they'll spend less now. Now, of course, that hasn't happened. Consumer confidence has actually held up. This graph shows you what's happened to quarter-on-quarter GDP growth. And since the referendum, it's actually gone back up to the sort of levels we've seen. Not quite as healthy as 2014, but actually quite credible levels. Now, of course, a few things have happened. The world economy has been more resilient in 2016. So some of our performance is due to the fact that we're trading with our trading partners have done better. For the first time in a long time, actually, since the economic crisis, all of the EU economies have grown at the same time. So that's been part of the pool. Bank of England has kept interest rates low, of course, has done quantitative easing. That's also helped. But it is essentially a consumer story. And this graph tells you how much of a consumer story it is. This graph shows you how much pay has recovered in terms of nominal pay, total employee remuneration, and the red line shows you household spending. And what that shows you is that as pay has gone up during 2016, households have gone out and spent this money. And this is what has caused the resilience. However, investment has slumped. And this is possibly more of a forward-looking indicator. Since the referendum, investment has remained business investment has remained low. And of course, one of the issues that we're seeing inflation creeping up now is that real spending might be depressed because consumers will find that their spending power is being eroded. So some of those negative effects in anticipation of Brexit might happen. But even if it doesn't, even if the economy remains resilient, there's no escaping that once we actually leave, that's when the effects will actually happen. So, of course, this is not a one-way street. Brexit will also have important costs for the EU, not just for the UK and Scotland. It is not a one-way negotiations, as Boris Johnson often reminds us. Brexit, if it reduces trade with the EU, will hurt the EU economies as well. But the point, and this is a really important point, it matters, the UK matters less for the EU economy than vice versa. I really get slightly dispirited in this when data is distorted in this debate. Let me just quote you something that David Davis said in his evidence session today, exiting the EU Select Committee just last week. And I quote, "Never forget it is 290 billion from Europe to us, whereas it's 230 billion from us to them, so it's important for them. The problem is that 230 billion for our economy is a bigger number proportionally than 290 billion over 27 economies. It's basic arithmetic. And I really get annoyed when you start being confronted with statistics like that, which are distortions of the fact. This slide shows you roughly what the issue is. UK is a sizable source of demand for the EU27, but not huge. It's about 0.5, 0.6%. If the EU's exports to us fall by 10%, their GDP effect is 0.05%. For us, our exports are worth about 13% of our GDP. So if they fall by 10%, it's 1.3% of our GDP. That's the magnitude size. So let's not pretend, of course it's costly. I think actually if you're going to point out how expensive it is for the EU, I would focus more on these issues. These are more realistic issues, I think, to focus on if you're worried about what might happen to the EU. The EU is worried about some of the issues. They're worried about the complexity of supply chains. The UK businesses are much more upstream in supply chains for a number of sectors around Europe. And they're worried because some of the things we produce, some of them are services, also in sectors like engineering, mining and chemical products. The UK is in that supply chain. So if we end up in a bad Brexit, in a cliff edge, then these companies that have supply chains spread across Europe will actually be hurt by the fact that the UK will be outside. And that does matter to the EU. Some countries in the EU care more, and I'll come back to that. And of course, I mentioned the FDI stock. Well, there's a lot of Dutch companies, etc., that have bases in the UK. They don't want that FDI value to be destroyed. Their other worry is no doubt that if the UK leaves the EU, it might actually undercut the EU on social regulation. It might go for a race to the bottom. Singapore and North Sea, all these other metaphors that have been used, essentially seeking to attract more jobs. That is a worry. Capital markets, and let me tell you one thing, in all the discussions I have, is that financial passporting, unless we stay within the European single market, is unlikely to be allowed. And I think in the UK, more people I speak to in the city have given up on the alternatives to passporting. For a while, there was the hope that equivalence, so-called equivalence, and some arrangements that would allow our regulations to be equivalent, declared as equivalent to EU regulations, would allow us to carry on exporting in an unfettered way in terms of our financial services to Europe. It now appears that I think the city has given up on all of this unless we are in the single market. So that's another issue. So these are the sort of issues that the EU does worry about. And the worry is that if some non-EU investment banks leave London, they won't go to Europe, they'll actually go back to New York, and therefore this will affect the depth of capital markets in Europe.